Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I'm well this evening, Jason. I'm coming to you from my son's bedroom.
I hope so. You've got a fair bit of Star Wars paraphernalia in the background.
Yeah, that's definitely not mine.
I picture you as more of a Trekkie than a Star Wars fan.
I don't think I fit into either of those categories, Jason.
No offense to any of our listeners.
No offense at all. I'm just not overly that way inclined, I think. Yeah.
Now we've had two episodes. We've had two episodes air so far this year. So this is actually though the first episode we're recording in 2022. Yes. How was your holiday?
It was very chill. I didn't do very much at all. Mostly just we had that horrible heat wave in Perth, so I mostly just stayed inside with the air conditioning and read some books, which was nice, and managed to get down to the farm and see my dad for a little while, which was good as well. And yeah, what about you?
Well, I managed to escape the heat. So I spent most of Christmas and a couple of weeks of Jan down in near Albany. Actually, our guest said that he visited Albany recently, as recent as 2018. And so he would know how much of a beautiful spot it was. And it was a good 10 to 15 degrees cooler than Perth. So I escaped all those 40-degree days, thankfully.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, look, our guest is patiently waiting, so we should probably let him in. So I'd like to introduce our guest. He is an honorary professor of organisational psychology at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and adjunct professor of occupational health at Acadia University in Nova Scotia, Canada. He has published widely on job burnout, work engagement, and workplace civility. His recent initiatives have focused on improving the quality of work life through enhancing the level of civility and respect among colleagues. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Michael Leiter.
Very good to be here. Very good to be here. So I'm really pleased to have a chance to talk with you today.
Michael, we are really thrilled to have you on. Ever since we had Dr. Catherine Page, who you obviously know from your time at Deakin, on, she mentioned that, she really loved your work and had a bit of a fangirl moment with you at the Vatican, I believe. And so we thought we got to get Michael on, and really stoked that you're able to join us today all the way from Canada.
All the way, yes. Yeah, we beat the heat wave here. It's actually -5 this morning, so no problem with the heat.
Yeah, one extreme or the other. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Michael, before we get into talking about the serious things, can you share with our listeners what some of your favorite podcasts are?
Oh, favorite podcast? Well, let me see. There's one called 99% Invisible. It's about design. It is fascinating. The host, Roman Mars, has the most perfect voice for doing this kind of work that you can just listen to his voice. It's very good. Mine's going at the moment. No, it's coming back. And then there is Radiolab is one a mainstay for years. It basically has a lot of really innovative kinds of ideas and approaches, and how it uses audio is just totally fascinating. So that's a regular one. And another I listen to, it's more of a background kind of a thing, but it's called Too Beautiful to Live. It is just two guys talking for an hour or so, or an hour and a half, where they just talk. They're just two guys, they're talking. It is on episode 3600. They just passed it recently. So they've been doing this for a while, 5 days a week, forever. And it's all about nothing particular. It's just two guys talking for an hour and a half. So if you just have some time, you're doing the dishes or whatever, it's a nice one to listen to. So, but anyway, there's a variety I listen to on all kinds of different issues, some very nerdy ones. The most nerdy one on COVID is called This Week in Virology, where you have a research virologist talking about viruses, and particularly COVID. And a physician comes on their Saturday program as a physician, and he's really telling what's the state of knowledge now for physicians across, whoever are listening from around the world. He is like, this is what we know this week about this thing. And it is very detailed, very nerdy, but it is quite informative. Quite informative. So anyway, there's a variety of things I listen to that way. I really enjoy the format.
Fantastic. That's a very broad variety of topics and things. I like the idea of two guys just recording themselves having a chat. Jason and I have joked about doing that ourselves, but we'd probably get cancelled if we did that. So we're best off avoiding that, I think.
You have to develop a listenership for sure. Yes.
Well,
it probably wouldn't have too much crossover with our current.
Yeah, I'm sure there'd be a few. There's a few weirdos in the audience, Jason.
Clive Lloyd would listen for sure.
Oh yeah. Big time.
He likes the dark humour. Yeah.
So Michael, can you share with our listeners a bit about your professional career, please?
Oh, okay. I did my doctorate. I got it at the University of Oregon in really clinical psychology, looking at doing family therapy. And that kind of, the thing that really stuck with me out of that program was the idea that really important problems actually exist in the space between people. Like I've always been in the kind of psychology, depth psychology sort of, I find it too spooky, the idea of what's going on deep underneath people's psyches. I like staying on the surface, like the kinds of things you can just see happening right in front of you, which is what I've applied in, really my career has been in organizational psychology since I really started working on it, which got going particularly in the 1980s, where I had a sabbatical coming up from my university here in Nova Scotia. And having read Christine Maslach's first article on burnout, I just phoned her up one day out of the blue and said, "Hi, I'd like to come work with you for a year on this." And she said, "Oh, sure, fine, here's an office." And so I drove 4,000 kilometers from Nova Scotia to California and brought the family, and we settled into the Bay Area for the year. And I learned a lot about burnout and did our first article off of that. And we've been writing together ever since. We just actually have a book now in the works with Harvard University Press. It'll be coming out later in this year. So we keep writing together and have lots of things going that way. So that's been a particularly huge theme throughout my work. And with that, the idea is that burnout, again, is a problem I see as existing between people. And so looking at the relationships among coworkers and with their supervisors, but basically the social dynamics of workplaces is where I find to be a particularly fascinating arena and a source of leverage for change. If you want to change people's experience, it's right there. And again, you can just see it happening. You don't have to go into any kind of imaginary space. It's right in front of you. And so that has been where I've been working more, which has taken me into looking at the workplace civility, respect, how people interact with each other, how they build on each other's capabilities. So that's been, really the focus in the past decade or so.
That's a wonderful story, just calling somebody up and saying, "Hey, let's collaborate," and then moving all the way across a continent and just doing it. That's fantastic.
Yeah, you got to leap out there. If you want to do something, you got to get out of your space and just try something different. And then you've committed a lot and you better make it work. And we made it work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think most of our audience would know you through your work with Christina Maslach on burnout. And burnout has gotten a massive amount of talking at the moment. In fact, I just posted on LinkedIn, shared an article that was written on Medium today regarding burnout. And it got a heap of likes and engagement and people really interested in. I'd love to hear it from the horse's mouth, if you like. We talk a lot about burnout, and on this show, we're talking more about health and safety and looking at systemic causes of work-related stress and how to protect the mental well-being of employees. And obviously, the popular approach to workplace mental health has often been focused on self-care and the individual and making the individual more resilient. But definitely, I guess, from your research, it's more around systems, right? And understanding the role of the workplace and the work environment and how that might influence employee well-being.
I really look at it as a relationship breakdown between the person and the workplace. And I find focusing too much on self-care. I mean, it's important to do that. And, having all those capabilities is quite vital. But if that's your sole focus, you get into the idea that the problem is the person. And that really workplaces are totally reasonable. Who could ever have any problem with how anybody's managing a workplace these days? It's sort of that kind of idea. Like, you have to be crazy to not love this job. But there's a lot of jobs that are not lovable. They're not lovable at all. They're actually quite flawed. And the issue isn't that the person is lacking resilience or lacking some kind of capability. Or it isn't even that the workplace is dysfunctional for everybody, because you generally doing a survey, you find actually most people are getting along in there. They found their way to get along with it. But it's really between the person and the workplace. It's the relationship, where they are in their career now, and that workplace, whether it's just not in alignment. It's really a mismatch at that point. And the strain is being carried, probably on both sides of the equation, but the individuals manifest that phase as the elements of burnout. And where people really do encounter their workplaces primarily is interactions with other people, their colleagues, that kind of interactions, members of work teams. That's one level that really defines a lot of their experience, gets down to fundamental needs of their sense of belonging and respect and confidence among people. And their interactions with their supervisor or other management is where they really encounter the values and the culture of what that workplace is all about. And so that is, and so if you want to look at what to do about this particular thing with, burnout is the one I've looked at a lot, but just in terms of getting along with people as well, you look between people. You don't really say, this person's got a problem, we got to build up their resilience so that they can tolerate a poorly managed workplace. You go, what's going on here? Can we get the person and the workplace more in line with each other, more so that they're heading in the right direction? It is not going to be better for both.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, really interesting and really on point. And hopefully more people hear that message. Definitely, there's a lot of discussion, and we do definitely feel the winds changing, and that people recognizing that, you don't deal with burnout through fruit bowls and yoga. You deal with burnout by not addressing symptoms, but addressing the working conditions, and like you say, that match between the employee and the and the work environment. Right,
and the increased signs of attention to and measurements and indications of burnout since the pandemic has begun isn't because people became less resilient in the last 2 years. That wasn't the problem. It wasn't a bottoming out of resilience. That isn't why people were having all these problems. It's because the nature of the work changed drastically, which has a good side and a bad side. Like, basically what the world showed, when you get all these things, we can't change this. You say, give people more flexibility on how they do their work. Give managers a more interactive, kind of management style, so they're really responding to people rather than directing people. And what happened in March 2020 was workplaces turned on a dime. They changed in a week. The whole world was working differently. And they go, what do you mean you can't change? You can change drastically when you really take a mind to change. And then they go, oh no, well, we can't change that, But really, to actually address any of these problems, whether it's workplace civility or job burnout, you got to change something important. It isn't, the painting the walls a different color. It really is changing something really important. And that's where you get a lot of reluctance from leadership. But they have to, so I think that's an important lesson to take, and something that really showed through the pandemic the last couple of years. The problem isn't that people became less resilient. the problem is that the workplace changed, sometimes for the better for a lot of people. A lot of people actually did quite fine with this working at home thing. But for a lot of people, it became much more strained and much more difficult and much more risky. And that was the issue that was driving burnout, wasn't a lack of resilience.
Yeah, no, so interesting and so perfectly explained. So tell us though, what are you working on these days?
Well, a handful of things. One is the civility approach, the SCORE program that we'll talk about here a bit. But basically, it's doing a work group level intervention on improving the quality of social interactions and looking at a downstream impact on how people score in terms of burnout and engagement and those kinds of ideas. So that's a particular big part. I'm not with the university anymore. I've wrapped up my university phase of life. I finally graduated after about 40 years, and so I'm still connected a bit with folks at Deakin and here at Acadia in Nova Scotia. But primarily, I'm working through. I have a consulting company, and I work a lot with people who are doing workplace surveys, particularly involving burnout and relationships, and helping them with designing, planning, and interpreting what they have from that. So that's a particular piece. And I'm writing a lot. So with Christina Maslach, as I mentioned, we did have a book that's now done and the works with Harvard University Press called The Burnout Challenge. And then with Kerry Cooper in UK, we're doing a book on burnout and the pandemic. So, and then in addition to that, I'm writing a lot about how we're doing the SCORE intervention piece. That a lot of that still happens in Australia. I'm partnering with Steeple Consulting that's based out of Melbourne, and they're actually implementing the program in various cities around Australia now. And so that is a partnership that continues. And so I'm working with that and working on the data and planning and adapting the program as we go forward.
Okay, so you may have taken the academic out of the institution, but you're still an academic at heart, right? You're still learning and researching.
Oh, yeah. That and those kinds of things. Yes, but a bit. I don't have to do as many reports. I don't have to do, mandatory training modules. None of that kind of stuff. No, I just.
So more of the research and the interesting stuff, and less of the bureaucracy.
Yes. Absolutely. Yes.
Beautiful.
So can you tell us a bit about SCORE then, Michael?
Okay, that's the acronym, because you have to have a pronounceable acronym, is strengthening a culture of respect and engagement. And so the idea there, with that wording is that workplaces already have a culture. You got to respect it, you got to acknowledge it, and then you try to strengthen that so it works more effectively for people. And it is it's basically doing family therapy with work groups, rather than saying, well, here's the problem child. Like when you take a family therapist, like a family brings in the rotten kid to the family therapist and say, fix the kid, we'll be back in an hour. And the therapist says, no, we're going to talk about all this together. This is what we do here. It's about how the relationships are unfolding in this family that we're particularly important, care about. And with SCORE, it's taking that same kind of model, but looking at a work group. The problem isn't that they've got a couple of obnoxious people who are bullies or just rude, whatever. But that the work group culture itself, work groups generally know how to handle people like that. Like, people are smart, people are very social. And when a work group of professionals, people, grown-ups who know how to run their lives, end up stuck in a lot of dysfunctional relationships, it's better to look for the answers between people rather than try to say, well, a couple of people have a problem with themselves and we should take them away and fix them, and then, or just get rid of them entirely. That it releases some kind of pressure, but I don't think it solves deep problems. Whereas when you go, what's going on with this group that this problem keeps persisting? And is there anything we can do with that? So it's a 5-sessions are about an hour and a half. Sometimes can go longer if people particularly got a lot of issues to deal with. And they happen a few weeks apart. The first one really is just introducing this idea about respect and civility at work and what's it all about, and asking, questions of the group. Say, tell me, what does respect mean in this group? How does that happen? Tell me a time that you felt really appreciated by one of your colleagues. What did they say? How did you feel? What was the situation? How did that happen here? And you go through some scenarios like that of just, what is the culture? How do things happen here? Do we really gush and say, oh, that was so wonderful what you did today? Or they go, nice job. Or like, how do you do it? Like, what's the culture for expressing support and respect and appreciation to each other? So you spend time on that to find out what is, acknowledging their culture essentially. And then you look on the other side. And once you get enough confidence, you say, well, how do you express disrespect here? Tell me about a time you felt disrespected in your work. What happened? How did you feel? What was said? Why was that important? That kind of thing. And given that we work with intact work groups, like we take a group of people who work together, like a ward on a hospital or a group in an office, an accounting office or whatever. So these are people, so the person who disrespected them is probably in the room with them at that time. So you've got to have a pretty solid facilitator who's ready to jump in and to manage how these interactions are going to go, because it can crank up pretty fast when you get people to open up on these things. So, but you got to talk about it. So you get there and find out, what does disrespect mean to this group? And given, like, you aren't even in the room unless that's an issue for this work group, so it's there, and you've got to bring it out and get. But it's talking about that, so it's acknowledging what's going on with that. Then the second session is really about how do you increase the amount of civility? Let's just look on the positive, because the idea, I think, a particular metric we look at here is the ratio of negative to positive. And generally, even with problematic work groups, most of the interactions are positive. That's the background. Like a really positive work group, it's like 98% of the interactions are really on the civility and respect end of the scale. And the difficult ones are more like 80%. So it isn't like a difficult work group is one where everybody's at each other's throat all day. They could just be snarking a little bit of the time, but just one person says one really rude thing to you in the course of the day, it throws you off. You don't need a lot of this. And particularly if it's your supervisor, you want to quit. You're looking for another job. So these are, can you just improve that ratio? Can we nudge it up? Let's get a lot more positive, because it just pushes out the negative. And it's much easier to encourage people to start a new behavior than to stop an old behavior. Stopping an old behavior is really tough. Starting new things, not so tough. Not easy, but not so tough. And so that's the second. And then the third one is, how do you respond to disrespect when it happens? That's our third focus, responding constructively to, like, when somebody says something rude to you, like, what's our protocol here in this group? How are we going to respond when that happens? Well, if I see two colleagues being rude, people are being rude to each other, just observing that, like, what's your intervention mode? What's our agreement as a group? This is what we're going to do. So if I come in and say, hey, you're really giving him entirely too hard a time, you can say, what business this is of yours? I can say, look, we agreed at the sessions that this is our protocol now. If I think something rude's going on, it's my responsibility to bring it up with you. It's not on me. It's not my weird thing I've got going. This is how we're building our culture now. That's the culture of urban strengthening. So that kind of thing you get going. And how is that going to work with this group? Like, groups are going to do this in a different way, and you've got to let them construct it. And then you continue that with the fourth session. And then the fifth session is really, how do we build in what we've learned and integrate it into our ongoing life as a work group? What are our rituals? What do we put into, like, maybe just have a thing in meetings so that there's always an agenda item on all of the group meetings on respect at work. And somebody has to bring in a news item or a report, something or other, they need to speak to them, put it on the agenda. We're talking about that. We're keeping this as an important part of how we work. This is how we work together. So this is the that's the broad strokes. We do like a survey before and after. We do a lot of things to set this up so that the group's in that kind of mind, because it's one of those things that you don't do it to groups. Groups implement it to themselves when they want to improve their work group, but the facilitator is critical for seeing that through. Groups, it's a tough cliff to climb for a group to try something like that on their own. Not saying impossible, but it's tough. But to have that kind of facilitation to take it through. So that's the broad strokes of it. And what we're finding is that, yeah, people can learn to be more civil to each other, and you can have a lasting improvement in that. And it really does have some downstream benefits that are quite important.
That's a really interesting process, Michael. And I think about, how an organisation would maybe traditionally try to address something like workplace incivility, and it would be something like we'll write a code of conduct and we'll make sure that everybody has some training, and then we'll have a disciplinary process for people who don't comply with the code of conduct, that sort of thing. And really what you're talking about is actually almost a cultural change initiative at a work group level. But you're starting it by actually framing it in the context that's relevant to that group. So, what might be, I think about our workplace, Jason, talking about things that people might perceive as incivility. What's, I guess, in our working environment would be, just the normal way that we interact with each other, and being Australian probably has something to do with that as well, and how we talk to each other in Australia. But for an outsider looking in, would potentially perceive maybe some of the stuff that goes on in our offices being quite incivil, when in fact we're having a lot of fun.
I know my wife came and visited one time and she was a bit shocked. You said what?
People have different styles. They really different styles. And that's why you got to adapt to it. You say, well, how did you understand that? How did you experience it? But sometimes you find with groups that what, maybe one person thought was a really good joke, the other person actually thought was quite offensive and really did hurt them. Yeah. It was quite hurtful.
Yeah.
And they hadn't really had that conversation, but it was really shaping their interactions with each other. Like then, person, you don't want to talk about that. You avoid interacting with somebody. And for a lot of groups where information moving around is vital, just even a hesitation to talk to somebody can be operationally problematic for a group. So yes, there is a lot of goofing around, and that does work, and it works very well, but there are limits to that. There are sometimes you find that things, and particularly when a group changes, and a lot of work groups over the past couple of years, the demographics of work groups have changed a lot. And what worked in the previous incarnation doesn't work with a more diverse demographic with that work group anymore. And sometimes people have to be dragged kicking and screaming into a new culture. And so that interaction, that kind of transition can be really, something to learn from.
Yeah. Lots of really interesting stuff there. And I really like that you sort of taking a process, but you're applying it to the context that's relevant to the group at the time, rather than just sort of trying to force everybody through the same, square peg in a round hole kind of a thing.
Yes. Yeah, there isn't really the one ideal code of conduct to apply to everybody. And it really does miss the point that way. And any research on workplace, organizational level kinds of interventions, if people don't feel in control of it, if you don't feel it's our process rather than something that management's inflicting upon us, then it doesn't work very well. That sense of control, that sense of this, we are making this happen to ourselves, is a powerful piece for if you want to make any kind of really lasting change in workplaces.
Yeah, I really like that idea of, getting work groups together to talk about, well, what is acceptable? Where is the line? What do we do if the line is crossed? Rather than enforcing, well, this is what your culture should look like. It's really about understanding the culture, but then understanding how the culture can be more, respectful and civil as well. So,
yeah, an example of how that particular piece there, I was just thinking of, I did one session with, it was a nursing program at one of the universities in Canada, and their thing was well, they had issues with the staff, but we started with the interactions with the students, that they have, their students would, coming from a lot of diverse, parts of the world, as well as age groups, as well as career backgrounds and everything. Like a nursing program's a different, it's not just the local undergraduates. It's a much more complicated kind of group that way. And so the students and the instructors would also, they would get really annoyed by some of the behaviors that students were doing, or just how they would talk. And then you'd say, well, you look at the students coming into the university, and some of the classes they go to, the instructor wants them to refer to me as Dr. So-and-so or Professor So-and-so. Another instructor wants to be referred to by their first name. And other people say, okay, well, if you come in late to the class, just come in, just do whatever, try that. But I would say, really, that's a real problem if you're coming in late. If you want to leave early, do you have to ask permission, or do you just get up and leave? What about cell phones? What about computers? What about what's on your screen? All these kinds of things. Is that, well, let's, in the first session, the first meeting of the class, let's talk about classroom civility. And like you got a lecture class, maybe 80 students or something like that. Let's talk about what we think is, people eating food, people drinking drinks, people, what are the kinds of things that people find annoying, and what do they find acceptable? And if you're going to watch, movies on your screen during class time, you have to sit in the back row. Let's just say that's the agreement. If you're going to give up learning and just watch movies, that's your choice, but in the back row and with earbuds that don't lead sound. That's your responsibility as a student in this class. It's because people are trying to learn something here. And that kind of idea of talking that through, and students have a lot to say about these things if you open up a classroom in that way, because that's their world, that they know what annoys them and what they think is respectful and disrespectful, how their peers are behaving in that world. So they've made a nice little parallel with this kind of to what we're doing with the work groups.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that employed by some trainers when they come in and they set down ground rules and what's acceptable and, what are we going to do if this happens and that sort of thing. I always found when I was delivering training, I was given such a short amount of time that you couldn't really do that. You had to get straight into the content. But you got to imagine, if you're not there for 3 hours, if you're there for 40 hours a week with those colleagues, it's probably worthwhile spending some time to work out what are the ground rules and what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, that's vital.
Yeah. So are there any specific industries that you've been working with the SCORE program, Michael?
Well, the primary thing has been in healthcare, and we did the first one with Western Health in Melbourne, but we've worked with some other healthcare settings since then. We've worked with police, air traffic control, firefighters, even a radio station and a small bank. So it's relevant to any place where people work together as a group, and particularly important if that interactions among people in that group, their communications, their cooperation, their integration of their actions is important for success. And so I think that's part of why healthcare is particularly interested in this, because that is such a just moving information around and integrating very diverse kinds of skills is quite important to how success occurs in that industry. But it's really relevant to so many in that way. So that's been the run so far.
Yeah, I guess there is so much knowledge transfer, handover, data handover within healthcare, as you say. You have lots of interactions to observe and potentially not be good. And when you've got tired, burnt out nurses, you can imagine that some of them might not always be their happiest, best selves on particular days.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, it's I can definitely understand, and it's the same thing with psych health and safety or burnout. If you've got people, you've got a likelihood that someone might be burned out or might not be doing mentally well. And same thing with civility and respect. Yeah, but definitely. Do you feel that in some industries that there might be more of an issue? We talked about healthcare, and can you think of any other industries where it might be more of an issue?
Well, we're starting one with higher education. Actually, that's the latest one. They have issues as well. I think whenever you've got a hierarchy, there's issues, because these days hierarchy, like basically, if someone thinks that they're of a higher order than one of their colleagues, it's really important that their other colleague actually buys into that. If they don't, there's a lot of problems.
Academics don't do that.
And academics don't do that. No, anyway. But healthcare has its, where you've got a lot of these, status levels that are quite important. That can lead to a lot of kind of differences. But basically, now if just everybody, like a need for belonging, a need to be part of a group, not only just to be, tolerated, but to really be respected and considered an important part of a group is so vital to people. It goes to that need for belonging, as well as for efficacy, as well as a sense of autonomy, that people will actually attend to you. You can actually make things start happening. But those kinds of needs all really fold out within a work group. And some work groups just get off track. Again, most of them, when we do our surveys across large organizations, most people are getting along, they're getting along fine, or okay, good enough anyway. They're not really complaining about it. It's really a minority of groups that get off track. But once they get off track, the self-correcting can really become dysfunctional. And so, so we'll go on to, when we look at hospitals, it's not always the same kind of hospital units that have problems. With one place, it's like the lab. Another place, it's the emergency department. And another place, it's really surgical units. It moves around, and it's part of it's just the lived experience of the people that are there, which is why I think these things can emerge most anywhere, because people get misunderstandings, and people, they have a hard time really fully acknowledging that relationships are a shared experience. A lot of people feel that they're on the receiving end of everything, and they don't really quite grasp that they're actually participating, that a relationship is something that you're part of, and not just simply, not something totally inflicted upon you. So I think that's part of what the learning that comes out of that it's not just them doing something to you, but that is a mindset that people get into pretty readily. That the more that you can say, actually, I'm part of this, then you get more control, and then you can start shaping your world a whole lot more. So that's applicable over a lot of settings.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So it might seem like an obvious question, Michael, but for our listeners, can you explain the relationship between civility and psychological health and safety?
Okay, well, one, yeah, as I was saying, like belonging is a basic psychological need, and people are going to be frustrated from that, and that if that's not happening, just loneliness is really a survival mechanism that pushes you. You've got to try to figure out how to connect with other people. It sort of pushes you that way, and there is a real lack when that is happening. So, and then relationships, interactions with people, like they're emotionally charged, and if it can't be resolved, then it's the kind of thing that people take with them. They ruminate over it. You think about it. Oh, what I should have said when that idiot, what I should have, that kind of thing. And people ruminating at night, losing sleep over it, trying to rehearse with themselves, like what am I going to do next time? And then they're not able to quite implement that kind of thing. So there's a lot of worrying, a lot of anxiety and social anxiety that comes from that, of interacting with people and trying to figure out, well, what's going to happen the next time that we encounter each other. So that kind of, it has a lot going down the road in terms of just sort of people's mental well-being at work, I think. And what we found with, the quality of the interactions is definitely related to like all three aspects of burnout. And not only that, people who experience incivility are going to feel more particularly cynical, that exhaustion and cynicism particularly kick in. But people who are experiencing exhaustion and cynicism are also going to behave socially less well. They're going to be more rude. Like when you're really exhausted and cynical, and just, it's hard to be really nice to other people. And those who receive a lot of incivility, also there's a correlation between what is received and what is given. So you end up perpetuating, and that's part of where the work group dynamics become embedded, is that people are exchanging back and forth a lot of these kinds of things. So all of that really moves away from a socially as well as psychologically healthy kind of workplace.
I think something that we've talked about a few times is this idea that, things like bullying or, incivility in terms of an individual's behaviour, a lot of the time it is framed as the individual being the problem, but actually there's a lot going on within the organisation or within the group that's actually sort of facilitating or triggering that behaviour. So we can see that kind of behaviour actually as an outcome of organisational factors rather than the problem in and of itself. And it's it sounds like the same is sort of what you're saying there for incivility.
Yeah, it's very much that on that level. But just on that topic, it's something I was thinking of in terms of podcasts, back to podcast again. You can get one from This American Life from a few years ago, might be even 10 years ago, but was called The Petty Tyrant. And it is a beautiful realization of what we were just saying, of the ultimate bully. There's something definitely crazy wrong with this guy. And then you find in the second half how embedded this is into a whole social structure of which there's a lot of players going on around this person's behavior. So social dynamics, people are evolved to really cooperate with each other and to struggle and to get things done and to cooperate and integrate their tasks. When it goes off and gets stuck in a bad corner, there is something happening on a social level, and the group needs some help with that. But that's really, whether you're looking at, just people being rude or just not talking to each other. People just come to their workplaces, go to their offices and never talk to each other. And you go, okay, well, that's not really what's supposed to be going on here either. So even not talking can be, you're not interacting can be a real problem that way. But it becomes part of the culture of the group that you've got to move the group if you want to make something happen here in a way. So those are important distinctions.
Where does neurodiversity come into that? Just, I guess, thinking about, people coming into the office and not wanting to necessarily socialize. And I think that there is, in some cases, the neurodiverse aspect of that is maybe sometimes overlooked by the group.
In which way? Well, I'm sorry, I don't know.
So I guess if you've, like if somebody is on the autism spectrum, for example, and then, what is comfortable for them or what is civil or a positive and doable working environment, the level of social interaction or what that might feel like for them might be quite different from a neurotypical group's perspective.
Yeah, and I think, and again, that's part of, right, by talking these things through, by having some in-depth kinds of reflection on these ranges, then a group can learn to, okay, that's a particular important piece that we need to understand, and we can accommodate that. But we thought he just didn't like us, but no, okay, we had these other issues that really is the way he's more comfortable here. He's going to work more effectively if he has more of that time on his own and less interaction with us. And okay, we can accommodate that. That works. But we thought he didn't like us. That's why he was doing that. And that was really troubling us, So being able to talk these things through and to understand that and to have explicit, agreements that this is how we're going to go forward here on that issue works a whole lot better than just leaving it unsaid.
No, absolutely. I think that's a really important point there. That behaviours can very much be misconstrued. And I just don't really like to talk to people in the morning, and everybody else thinks I'm being rude, maybe. Jason's laughing about my caffeine requirements in the morning before I stop being a raging beast.
It is unsafe to go near Joelle before 10 a.m., Michael. So, but we
good
all
to know your
know
safety
that
protocols.
it's something we've all spoken about. It's all well understood. It's part of the induction for new starters. So, yes.
Okay. Good to know. Okay.
So, I'd love you to explain to our listeners, Michael, why your interventions are more focused on the work group level rather than the organisational level.
Well, that's where interactions are happening in the most intense kind of way. And that's the medium I'm working with, are social interactions among people. The stuff when you get to the whole organizational level, so much of the interactions are, more scripted kind of announcements and that kind of thing, which isn't really what I'm working on. That's not really that doesn't have the emotional and operational kind of impact as the work group. And as we talked about before, individual level, I just think that's, it's been done, and it's just not particularly interesting to me, what's going on that level. It's really what's going on between people. And that's the piece. And I really think that's where, when you really need some in-depth change, you've got to get at that level. Again, like we talked, like issuing the code of conduct doesn't really change the dynamics of groups, but getting into these kinds of interactions does.
Yeah, I think we all might be biased in that we come from the School of Organisational Psychology. I know you originally studied clinical, but we like to look at systems rather than individuals primarily. But it's something that we often talk to companies about, because when they're doing things like psychosocial risk assessments, they'll often conflate what they're doing with the employee engagement survey, which is usually done on a global level. And kind of like you look at employee engagement globally, and then you think about interventions globally. Whereas when we talk about things like the workload, role clarity, autonomy, relationships, civility and respect, it can be very different from work group to work group. And coming up with an organizational level intervention is, first of all, understanding it at an organizational level is probably going to be muddy, because you're going to have, all schools all over the place, depending on what team people are in. And then if you're going to create an intervention, it's not going to necessarily suit every team, because they're all going to have different kind of issues. So we're very much of the same vein, where we believe it's actually the work team level, which is probably the best place to understand issues and intervene, rather than purely doing that at a global level.
Yeah, it is really important to integrate what this whole little operation is within a larger organizational policy, so that when they do have things laid out, well, how do you deal with complaints about severely disruptive behavior, that is consistent with what we're doing with these kinds of groups. It's a really different kind of problem. And if you are looking at how do you take a really a good functioning team and make it a really great team, it's a different kind of process. You don't apply this particular thing because you have different kinds of issues, but there should be a conceptual consistency with it about these are what we're looking at. This is how we look at work group culture. And there should be consistency, because I think what we do with SCORE is take groups from, operating operating somewhat badly to being okay. Maybe a little better than okay, but they don't go from problematic to great in one big step. I think there are other things you need to do to go from doing pretty good to going to truly great, but there needs to be a conceptual, straight consistency between that, some idea about how people interact and what is the cultural and issues that are important for this particular workplace.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've taken us through sort of the step-by-step or the session-by-session process that you would follow while you're implementing a SCORE program. What sorts of outcome measures do you assess?
Well, in terms of surveys, the core part of the survey that we use with all the groups is I've developed something called the social encounter scale, which I like because it measures civility. It's just 3 items per thing, but civility, incivility, and intentional intimidation, which I think bullying means almost everything to anybody. So I didn't want to use that word in terms of colloquial. So, but basically those three levels, the positive, the negative, and the really negative. And I ask about it from the immediate supervisor, from coworkers, and also what are you generating yourself? How often were you expressing appreciation to a coworker in the past month? So that's a particular measure, and you really get an idea of the dynamics of a group when you look at how that fits together. It's like a good individual measure, but it's also a very interesting group measure when you sort of integrate the perspectives together. And then the second way, I use them as like burnout inventory as our downstream kind of impact. Depending on the client, we use other things. There's things that look at areas of work life. It could be things pertaining to anxiety and intention to quit or all kinds of things like that. So, but those looking at the interactions and looking at the exhaustion, cynicism, and efficacy issues on the burnout scale are what I've been using as the primary measures. And then, in addition to that, we do interviews with people afterwards to find out, well, what do they think of it? Do they think it made a difference? And then what particularly of anything that really did impact you? What really had an effect on you? What did you think was particularly powerful, important? Where did you learn something? Where did you gain some insights? So that we know what is it about the program that's working, but also how does it operationalize? What is it that has an effect on people? With this kind of organizational intervention, it's not like doing, randomized control trials. You can't, people are actively participating and designing what's going on, and no two groups are the same. So you have to really get a good grasp of how they comprehend what's happening to understand what the intervention is all about. So those interviews become important in that way.
And are you seeing some consistent themes coming out of those interviews?
Oh yeah, that one. Everybody hates role plays, but role plays are very powerful, and they really got to keep doing them. But it takes we need very charming facilitators to be able to bring people on board, but also very firm and say, no, that's what we're doing here. We're all doing this. You're not sitting it out, and that kind of idea. So that kind of thing, the idea that the group creates its own ground rules and that the facilitator revisits those at the beginning of every session and reviews what's happening. Are you yourself, are you perceiving others acting in according to our ground rules, or are the things that we need to work out here? Do we need to add something or subtract something? But the fact that that's made very real throughout the process is a powerful piece of the process, and makes it more real. And again, that idea that people feel in control of what's happening is an important piece of that.
Yeah, and so there's an aspect of sort of reflection and accountability at every one of those sessions then, by the sounds of it.
Yeah. Yes. We're going for, like, insight by itself is not sufficient, but you have to have insight. It's necessary, but not sufficient for enduring change. So that's worked on.
I'm interested, Michael, with all the pre-post evaluations that you've done, including the qualitative pieces, has the program changed much in the last year or two since you've been deploying it?
Actually, it hasn't changed much. No, we got it. We a few tweaks to it, but basically, no. I think partly because I worked with a previous version of this, but this was an improvement on, at least from my point of view, from what we had done before. And so that was, I think we had a lot of learning from that previous thing, and that this basically, we haven't had to tweak it a whole lot. It works.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. It's nice. But obviously, it isn't necessarily version 1 because, like you said, you did something similar previously, but this is a new and improved. So you're really looking at production now rather than a beta version.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm sure some of our listeners could guess, but maybe you could spell it out for them. What are some of the benefits for improving civility at a work group level?
Well, I mean, one, just people's experience. You're going to be able to, people, they say people don't quit a job, they quit a boss, but they also quit a team. And so the quality of social relationships keeps people engaged with the job, the place, but also with their work. And then so much of work now is shared. It's very few things. There's very few people working all on their own, just doing their own thing and being productive in that way. Everybody's work integrates with other people's work. And the smoothness of those interactions is quite vital. So operationally, I think it's quite important that that happens. And then it's an employer's responsibility to, they have some responsibility for the quality of social dynamics that are happening within their work groups. And they need to have a capacity to respond when things are not really happening well, because it really does go to the essence of occupational health and safety. And employers have a real responsibility there to look at that, but they need to have some tools to know, well, what do we do when things go off the rails? So I think those are important downstream pieces of this in terms of experience, productivity, and just compliance with the world we live in.
Yeah.
So are you able to share a case study with our listeners?
Right. Well, the one I can share most readily is with Western Health in Melbourne, because it was actually written up in HR Management magazine a couple of years ago. So it's not all that discreet at this point. And so that was really our first one. I was at Deakin at that point, and I had met up with folks that at Steeple Consulting, and they already had a working relationship with Western Health at that time, and they had read some of our previous work, the previous stuff that I had written on workplace civility and what to do about it. And then they said, "Oh, that's something that we need here." Again, not across the board, but we have some units that really need some work on this kind of thing. So it just became a great opportunity. I had this in my mind that I worked with the previous thing. I had designed out what I wanted to do next. And so this was the opportunity to apply that. So we implemented the group. So with Steeple was Joe Wintle in Melbourne, who was the facilitator on our first go rounds of all of this. We implemented in the first round with 3 work groups. One was with sort of aged care, another was an outpatient clinic, another was a hospital, inpatient unit. And we just did the program as it was laid out that way. And we would meet before and plan out the next session and debrief the previous one and plan out the next session. And see, we were working with it very much hands-on that way. So, and they, basically, the groups, we had the pre-measures that showed, we did a larger survey, so we knew sort of what the metric was for our measures within the larger hospital. So we could see these groups who were working with, one, they had problems, that was from the evidence, but also they had a very high participation rate in the pre-survey. It was one of our markers. If they don't do the pre-survey, we're not going to do the implementation, because that's the easy part. That's the easy part. And so you needed a good participation there, that they really wanted to do this. And so we had that with these 3 units. And we were able to show that basically they went from, definitely subpar relative to other groups on civility and civility and aspects of the burnout scale, to being slightly above par at the end of the process. So that had made this real difference over the, I guess, about 4 months it took to implement the program that way. And so we then ran a second go round with 3 more units and a second go round there. And again, we found that kind of similar kind of impact that way. So we were going along there and then looking forward to doing more. And then we started running into 2020, and everything sort of went off that way. But basically, it worked very well. We had people, again, the units and the unit managers actively, we informed what this was. I went and did some talks with them, and they, so they decided they were going to participate in this. It wasn't assigned to them in that way, but they decided to get on, and so it worked. And then during the pandemic, we have worked with some other healthcare institutions and doing it online. So we've done the Zoom version of SCORE as well, and that has happened too. So it the process, it sets up and it goes. Yeah.
And do you sort of come back and do like a 6 months post evaluation and see if things have stuck?
Yeah, that's where I do the interviews. I sort of come back later and see that. But also, we've done surveys a year later when we're doing sort of more follow up with the other groups. So we're including our original groups in that. So we have ideas. We have a metric for how they're going, and it does last. But again, you have to make it last. It's not really automatic forever. You really, the important part is you're setting up a framework that will keep these things live as you go forward. It isn't just, oh, we fixed you forever now. It's not like it's not like it's not a cure forever. It's not an antibiotic. It's much more like a fitness program.
Yeah, as are a lot of things. When there is no silver bullet, unfortunately, things still take a little bit of effort over time in order to maintain healthy, either relationships or psychological or physical health. Now, Michael, one of the questions that we ask all of our guests is thinking about the future of workplace mental health. What would some of your hopes be?
Oh, that workplaces, I guess, as I see that it's really an issue of design and flexibility. I think these are very important parts. If you're going to have a really psychologically healthy workplace, that there needs to be more thought about the design of just people's experience there. Like, how do people come to work? What's their day going to be like? What in terms of social interaction, in terms of opportunities to take initiative and to make things happen, and to think, how does that, thinking through those kinds of things more, like, it's not just the work process step by step, but also how is that experience going to be there? And I think another important part is to give a lot of thought that people are looking for more from workplaces than simply being healthy. People have aspirations. They're looking for making a meaningful contribution. A lot of people are. Some people are just looking for a paycheck, but that's okay. But some people are looking for a lot from their workplaces, and to interact with them about that, so that those expectations are aligned with what the possibilities are here, but also to keep developing the possibilities so that more of those aspirations can be fulfilled. And as I mentioned earlier, basically, workplaces can really change when they really want to on very fundamental issues that we keep hearing, oh, we can't change that, we can't give. Building in more flexibility, particularly for first-line managers to be able to really respond to what's happening with their people, is going to be, that's a critical piece. And that's, I think, fundamental to how people are going to function within their workplaces going forward.
Yeah, and let's hope it doesn't take another pandemic for companies to be willing to change some of the status quo, right? Yes,
that they can actually aspire to really having workplaces that are designed for people rather than just for productivity.
Absolutely.
So, Michael, we have a variety of listeners that tune into this podcast from different sort of professional backgrounds, as well as early career and students. Do you have advice for people who are thinking about working in this field of psychological health and safety?
Oh, I think there's a lot to be done looking at the space in between, and that in between space, looking at it as a relationship, that really the issues that are really important are the ones that lie between workplaces and people. And there's an entirely too much of a Freudian bias, I think, and looking about all these things, that there's some kind of deep underlying whatever going on. I think that's a red herring. I think it's the important things, the things that you can really have an impact on, are the stuff on the surface. The surface is great; it's fascinating, and just look at it and figure out how to nudge it a bit in the right direction.
That's some excellent advice. Thank you, Michael.
Michael, it's been amazing having you on the podcast today. Someone who's done so much work in this area of burnout and now more increasingly, I guess, around civility and respect. They're two topics that come up again and again on this podcast. So great to have, one of the heavy hitters in this space, if you like, on the podcast. So thank you so much for your time this early morning, your time.
Okay, well, I really enjoyed talking with you. This has been a great beginning to the day. I'm going to go find that second coffee, so I become even more charming after that.
Well, thank you so much. So that brings us to the end of the episode, listeners. Remember that we do record these while we have our Zoom meetings, and we do put them on the FlourishDX YouTube page. So feel free, if you prefer to watch rather than listen, to check it out there. Also, we take the best snippets out of these talks and put them on the FlourishDX LinkedIn page. So feel free to check that out if you want to follow along and see some of the nuggets that came out of today's discussion. There was quite a few. And while you're on LinkedIn, feel free to connect with myself and Joelle if you want to continue the conversation. But thanks a lot again, listeners, and we'll catch you next episode.